Hi, I'm Sunil Badami and welcome to another Roaring Stories online author event here in the bookshop. It's really great to have your company and I'd love to welcome you to probably one of the most monumental events in the history of Australia. Now, we'll have time for questions later, so if you'd like to ask our guest, Jenny Hocking, a question, you'll have time to do so by asking on the stream on Facebook live stream. So please post your questions in the comments now and I'll read them out for you later. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of this country. Now, please feel free to share your thoughts, comments, ideas on any of our socials on Instagram, Twitter, or on Facebook with the hashtag Roaring Stories and hashtag Palace Letters. Now, does anyone remember how we were taught to remember the 5th of November? Guy Fawkes Night commemorates the gunpowder plot to blow up the English Parliament in 1605. But over 370 years later, as Gough Whitlam, Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam observed on the steps of Old Parliament House, Remembrance Day, 11th of November 1975, would live in infamy. The dismissal became a flashpoint for our status as an independent nation and a sticking point for those concerned by the role a distant foreign monarchy might play in our domestic political affairs. But for all the backroom deals and politicking in Canberra, the monarchy's part in this constitutional crisis has never been quite clear, mainly due to the correspondence between hapless Governor-General Sir John Kerr and the royal household in the days leading up to and after the dismissal being kept secret by a personal embargo by Her Majesty the Queen. In 2016, this was challenged by historian Jenny Hocking, who took her case for their release to the federal and then high courts, taking on the National Archives, the federal government, and the monarchy itself in a multi-million-dollar battle that resulted in these explosive letters finally being released to the public in July this year. Fittingly, Bastille Day. The Palace Letters, published by Scribe Books, is a gripping and eye-opening account not only of the shenanigans going on behind the scenes before the dismissal, but of Jenny's intense Adam versus Goliath battle for transparency and access to the public record. Professor Jenny Hocking is an award-winning biographer, emeritus professor and political commentator. She's the author of the acclaimed 2-volume biography of Gough Whitlam, A Moment in History, and Gough Whitlam, His Time, both published by Melbourne University Press. And she's the winner of the Fellowship of Australian Writers Barbara Ramsden Award and shortlisted for several awards, including the Prime Minister's Literary Awards and the National Biography Award. Jenny is the inaugural Distinguished Whitlam Fellow with the Whitlam Institute at Western Sydney University and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. Nikki Tugwell is a senior producer at the ABC with 20 years broadcast and media experience in Sydney, New York, London and Melbourne across print, audio, TV and documentaries. She's worked with some of the biggest names in Australian political journalism, including producing the 2 federal elections and the 2016 US election. She's not only the senior producer on The Week with Charlie Pickering and the flagship current affairs show 7:30, last year, she also executive produced the ABC's chart-topping podcast series, The 11th, about, guess what? The dismissal. So please welcome Jenny and Nikki.
Thanks so much, Sunil, for that fantastic intro. And it's lovely to be with everyone tonight and to have an opportunity to be in conversation with Jenny about her fabulous new book, The Palace Letters. Jenny and I first met in 2018 in December in my capacity as executive producer of the 11th podcast series. And Jenny was absolutely the first person that I picked up the phone and called when we started development, because her storyline in our series was the only active storyline, and so we didn't know how it was going to play out and how it was going to unfold. And needless to say, at that point, I paid close attention to Jenny's courageous and relentless quest to have the Palace Letters released from the National Archives, and followed her through the court processes, and really just hung on every twist and turn. I'm the first to admit I didn't actually think that the Palace Letters would be released. Such was the enormity of the challenge that Jenny faced up against the National Archives, and obviously going up against the wishes of Buckingham Palace. So reading this book, Jenny's new book, The Palace Letters, and getting a bird's eye behind the scenes understanding of what went into that quest and the fight that was taking place behind the scenes was absolutely fascinating. So Jenny, welcome again, and congratulations on the book. I'll invite you to say a few words to start with, and perhaps even tell us how you've managed to get this book published in such a short amount of time, since the release of the letters was only in July.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and I want to thank everybody at Roaring Stories, Dan Jordan and Kate Prendergast, and of course Sunil Badami for inviting me here today, and of course Scribe Publishing and Henry Rosenblum at Scribe for being marvellous publishers and working with me, as you said, Nikki, to get the book out reasonably quickly. And of course, Nikki, thank you for being the wonderful In Conversationalist today. I'm really looking forward to it. Look, I had, as you've said, been working on this case for more than 4 years, and I'd actually started writing the book before the letters came out, which meant that I began the book really not anticipating necessarily that we would suddenly have 212 letters in full released within a few months of me starting on the book. So the book changed along the way, and that presents certain challenges, but it was a real race to the finish line, I have to say, to get it out by the 11th of November, which is what we wanted, and we had it out just at the end of October. But in a way, in a funny sort of way, in this crazy time when we were in total lockdown in Melbourne, what did I have to do except write a book? So I spent, hours every day when I might have otherwise been doing something else, working pretty solidly on the book. And I have no doubt it would never have come out in the way in which it has otherwise. But it is a book that covers all those things you mentioned. Probably 2/3 of the book are actually working our way through that fascinating sort of search for the letters in the archives, and then of course the way the research becomes a legal action, and that legal action eventually ends up in the High Court, and probably only 1/3 of the book is actually looking at the letters themselves, but obviously a very important part of it.
And Jenny, I wanted to mention that style that you spoke to me about a little bit earlier, and that was writing in the first person and in that narrative style, which really brought the audience along with you, and it felt like we were part of the journey with you, and it felt like we had this privileged access, I guess, to what was happening behind the scenes, and it just makes the material really accessible, I think, to a new audience and to people who know the material well. It just was a really refreshing take on it. So I really enjoyed that. How did you find writing in that style?
Yes, it's really interesting you picked up on that, because as an academic, I am not used to writing in the first person. And I found that really interesting, I have to say, but very challenging, because it did make me realise how much, when you write in the third person, as I have with many biographies and other books that are non-fiction, there's a certain safety in that. You're hiding behind the third person that is actually, of course, totally bound up with who you are and how you interpret the material. And it's like a safety valve. You can be there, but you're taking the reader on a journey that is not your journey in that personal way. I realised very quickly with this book, and particularly because Henry Rosenblum at Scribe, who's been a marvellous guide along the way, was very clear that it was a story I had to tell as my story. And so once I came to understand that, I tried to very much write it in a sense as a political thriller, because that's how it unfolded to me. It was a journey, it was long, but every time I found something new in the archives, I found it quite exhilarating. So I really wanted to bring that sense of excitement, even though we're dealing with what ultimately became a court case. And I was pleased with that because I felt that there was really no other way to tell the story. It had to be a story that I carried with it. And in the end, I stopped seeing it as being about me and just saw it as being about this character who happened to be me that was taking us through the journey. And surprisingly, I'd forgotten how many notes I kept along the way. I think every time, and even more remarkably, I found them all. And I think every time we were in the courtroom, and we had a lot of courtroom events, I just found the whole thing so intriguing, but also I think it was a way of focusing my thoughts, that I just kept a lot of notes of who was speaking, what the room looked like, how I felt in that room. We got caught in an absolutely tumultuous rainstorm in Sydney trying to get to the federal court hearing, the full federal court. And all of these things I'd made notes about that were so helpful later. So in many ways, it was an enormous pleasure to go back and retrieve them and set them into some sort of style and structure. And the only other thing I'll mention is that I worked very hard at breaking up the court case with other sort of stories about things that happened to come out in the archives during my various searches. And that was a way of really taking the reader out of the court case when it might otherwise get too long, move back into the archives and find something there. And again, I think that's worked really nicely in pacing the book forward.
I think that did work really well. And something that I was thinking when I was reading it is how you must have kept such good notes as you were going through, because you really set the scene so beautifully on various different occasions where, you've painted a picture of what it was like, whether you be in Sydney or London or other places. And I was wondering how early you made that call actually to write in the first person, because it looked like you from the get-go were taking those notes. Yeah,
look, it's funny, Nikki. I hadn't formalised that process in my mind. It was almost as if to salve my nerves every time we sat in a courtroom, I'd madly be making notes. But I did see it all very visually. I've done script writing as well, and I think there's a sense of drama and visuals because it's such an unusual experience. I'll never be back in a courtroom in that way again, certainly not at the High Court. And so I was certainly really keen to get some sense of what it was like, what that experience was like, and how much the law is both a wonderful, extraordinary opportunity, but also so very distant from people. And I hadn't thought about a book really until probably the last year of the case, when a couple of people, quite significant people, would send me notes saying, I hope you're working on a book. And I thought, well, actually, yes, it should be a book, and I'm the person who should tell it. So, look, I'm absolutely delighted that it's out. I love the photo sections as well. We had some marvellous photos of the legal team, both at the federal court and later at the High Court. And they're just things that no one else could bring to this story that I think really brought it alive.
I think that's such a good point too, Jenny, because, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but because of the nature of the release of the Palace letters in the end, where it was public, and so everybody has access, everybody can interpret it, and then sort of write their take on it. This was the distinction for you, and your point of difference is that it was, you're the only person who could write this because it was your journey. So I thought that was it really made sense. So it was that technique worked really well.
Thanks.
I was just going to backtrack a little bit here, Jenny, and you've written many books, including Gough Whitlam's biography, volumes 1 and 2, and I was just curious about how you first met Gough, and if there's any particular memories you have from writing his biographies that's always stayed with you.
Yes, a lot of memories. I'd actually written 3 biographies before. One on his Lionel Murphy, who was Whitlam's Attorney General and later, of course, Justice of the High Court of Australia. That's when I first met Gough Whitlam. I interviewed him for that. I was also scriptwriter on a film about Lionel Murphy called Mr. Neil is Entitled to be an Agitator. Wonderful film, wonderful, marvellous film, directed by Daryl Delora, who happens to be my partner. So it's an excellent film. And we co-wrote that script with Ian Wansborough. But a very moving and powerful film. And I also interviewed Gough Whitlam for that on camera. I did the interviews on camera. So I'd met him, but only in that fairly formal capacity. And so when I later decided to write a biography of Gough Whitlam, it was very much me approaching him. This was not his authorised biography in any sense. it was me as a biographer. I'd already written also a biography of Frank Hardy, the Australian writer and communist and extraordinary individual. And when I approached Whitlam, it was very much along the lines of, I am writing your biography and I would like to interview you. So we had very clear parameters. He didn't see the book before it was released, and he was not well by the time I finished the second volume. So I took a copy up to him, of course, but he was not really well enough to discuss some of those matters towards the very end. I certainly have a lot of memories, because he was very generous with his time, particularly early on when he was not yet becoming unwell. And he spent an extraordinary amount of time, 2 very long interviews over 2 days on 3 separate occasions, doing extended interviews about so many things. It was just enthralling. And those interviews are all in the Oral History Collection in the National Library. So that's a marvellous thing. But what will always stick in my mind was something that happened with Volume 1. There's actually one from each volume. In Volume 1, to my absolute astonishment, when I was trying to find out more details about Whitlam's grandfather, I found a file in the Victorian Public Records Office headed Henry Hugh Gough Whitlam prisoner. And to my astonishment and Gough Whitlam's absolute amazement, his grandfather had spent 4 years in Pentridge Prison as a youthful, a sort of embezzler, in one sense a victimless crime. The family was poverty-stricken and he had tried to cash a cheque in his employer's name and his own name to tide him over. But I was faced with a terribly daunting task of having to go up to Sydney and tell Gough Whitlam that the grandfather he knew and loved and was named after had actually spent 4 years in Pentridge as a young man. And that was a really interesting discussion, because I'd taken all of the documents with me so that I could show him, so that he could be aware of this and where it had come from. And for the first time in our entire discussions, he was utterly silent and he just said nothing. And then about 20 minutes later, he came back to it unexpectedly, and he suddenly said, because his father was the Commonwealth Crown Solicitor, Gough's father, and he suddenly just looked at me and said, isn't it interesting that in one generation my family moved from one side of the law to the other? And it was a marvellous, and he also said, it just goes to show what a good public education can do. And I thought, what a typical Whitlam comment. He summed it up perfectly. It was an extraordinary thing that in a single generation the family would change so much. And his father, a brilliant student, got a scholarship to Carey in Melbourne and was able to continue and finish secondary school, and then had a scholarship to study law. But the family fortunes changed dramatically. So that was a marvellous find. And I think he was immensely impressed, apart from the fact that they then called him grandfather the felon in the family, but he said I'd found something he didn't know about his own family.
Oh, that's so great. When I was making the 11th podcast series, and also when I've been working at 7:30, one of my favourite things is really delving back into those archives and hearing those radio reports and the press conferences from the time, and really kind of reliving, immersing yourself and reliving the events as they happened. One of my favourite pieces of visual archive that I stumbled across, and I'm sure you were familiar with years ago, was a press conference of Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser that happened hours after the dismissal. And there was there were 2 particular questions that just were so interesting to reflect on so many years later. And I got a special thrill, I think, out of seeing the fact that you opened your book with that exchange between the reporters and Whitlam, in which case they were asking whether Gough thought that maybe the Governor-General, after the dismissal, had been consulting in any way, shape or form with Buckingham Palace or the Queen. And it just was, the question, particularly on the eve of the letters being released, just was so relevant. You obviously chose that quote for a similar reason, I guess.
I did, and I'll just read it. I chose it because I think it reflects several aspects of the dismissal that have only come to light more clearly in recent years. But it's also a question about whether the Queen might have known anything. And as you say, that was asked of him immediately. And it was asked of him repeatedly in all of the many, many interviews Whitlam did at every anniversary of the dismissal that never went away, this great fascination. And the quote was, "Do you think the Queen knew about this course of action?" And Gough says, "I shouldn't think so, but I don't know." And the follow-up was, "Do you think the Governor-General took any advice from Buckingham Palace?" And he said, I don't know. I was not informed that he had." And to me, that summed up such a lot, because it highlights that Whitlam himself, it's almost as if as he's speaking, he's aware that actually there are things he's not aware of. It's the sort of known unknowns. And you look back at what was said at the time of the dismissal, and you're struck by the fact that Whitlam is completely and utterly in the dark. He's been deceived by the Governor-General. He's been deceived by the Leader of the Opposition, who ought never to have been speaking to the Governor-General constitutionally, but had been. And now we know that on a great many fronts, he was not aware that the Governor-General was indeed, on key points, seeking advice and comment and input in his final decision from the Palace, and particularly Sir Martin Charteris, the Queen's private secretary. So it highlights that great disadvantage Whitlam had throughout the 11th of November 1975, which was the disadvantage of ignorance born of deception. For example, the simple fact that when he is dismissed from office by the Governor-General at 1 o'clock on the 11th of November, he has gone out to Yarralumla, he thought, to call the House Senate election, which he had arranged with the Governor-General over the previous 6 days. There was no secret about that. They'd finalised the wording of various letters just that morning. Whitlam was to announce it in the Parliament that afternoon. And as he goes to hand the letter, Kerr puts his hand up and says, "I have a letter of my own," and it was the letter dismissing him. It was already signed, it was already done. Now, Whitlam didn't know when he left that office. He described it to me as the greatest shock he had experienced in his entire life. He left down one end of the long Yarralumla corridor, unaware that emerging from the other end of the Yarralumla corridor was Malcolm Fraser, the Leader of the Opposition, who'd been waiting for him to be dismissed, obviously forewarned, aware of what was happening. It was only the next day that a reporter told Whitlam that Fraser had been sitting in the same building waiting for Whitlam to be dismissed. That's the level of deception of our elected head of government. I mean, it's a shocking time in our history, constitutionally and politically. But it meant that all through that day, Whitlam was battling things with moving goalposts. And so people say, why didn't he, stop the Senate? Why? Well, he didn't know that once supply was passed, Kerr was not going to follow the motion of no confidence in the House and reappoint him as Prime Minister. He couldn't be second guessing all the way along about matters that he had not been told about. And yet that's how many people interpret that day. And I think what I like about that particular quote, opening it up, is that Whitlam is quizzical about the possibility of the Palace having had advice. But as he said, I wouldn't know, because he was the last to know everything. So it just seemed a perfect way into the book.
No, it was a great opening. I really enjoyed, understanding a little bit about what you discovered, Jenny, on your journey, but also at times there were little elements where I thought, oh, wow, are there still things that we don't know that are still secret? And one of them, you write about initially discovering Sir John Kerr's papers, and one file that you discovered were documents packaged together in an envelope marked private and confidential, and those notes were relating to constitutional crisis and Sir John Kerr's 1980 personal diary. The other file was intriguingly called Contents of a Light Brown Case, and when you found this file, it was empty. I'm curious to know, did you ever find the documents from that file?
I certainly found a file, as you say, which simply said this contained the contents of the light brown case, and there was an envelope with that title, but nothing in it, absolutely nothing in it. So my thoughts are that that's either been farmed out to other files, which without its identifying feature, or yes, perhaps there are other documents. I have no doubt there are other documents, because these documents keep emerging all the way along. But I put that particular description in there because every now and then you come across this very strange, almost film noir element of certainly a B-grade sort of political thriller element in the visuals of it. And I found that quite intriguing, the thought that Sir John Kerr's writing on an envelope the contents of the light brown suitcase. And the first thing you think about is, where is the light brown suitcase? So, it's just that sort of boy's own annual type stuff, like a cheap spy novel, that I really liked every now and then to just bring us back to in the archives, because some of the archival practices, frankly, really are quite ridiculous. But it is a long and complex process, matching up archives one against the other and seeing if you have the full bits. And because so much of the dismissal history has been secret and has only come out really sort of in a fragmentary way, I never say never about any of this stuff. I mean, we never knew of Sir Anthony Mason's role, a vast number of things that were simply unknown to us that you can't possibly guess at until you find the material. But I think I'm pretty much done with trying to locate material that I have a fair idea is there. And it's for others, I think, now to take that journey into another direction if there's something else they want to keep looking for.
You write, Jenny, about Sir John Kerr wanting the palace letters released in the lifetime of his children. Given how the letters reflect on Sir John, why is that? Why do you think he thought that the letters would vindicate his actions?
He was very keen for the letters to be released, really keen. In fact, there's several examples of him pleading with the palace directly in 1980 in that journal that I found. He goes out to see the Queen's private secretary, then private secretary Sir Philip Moore, pleading with him to at least allow some of the extracts of his letters to be known. He believed it would validate the story he had put in his memoirs. And indeed, in many respects, they would, because he quotes from some of the letters without referring to them as letters, but you can see the language is very similar in descriptions in his memoirs. The problem is for Kerr that with the passage of time, of course, those key aspects of his memoirs have been shown to be deeply flawed. And there's a massive omission in his memoir, which we might talk about later. But no doubt he wanted, I think, also the ballast of people knowing that the palace had been speaking to him about matters that were directly relevant to the dismissal. And we would now look at that and say, well, they had not voiced any opposition to that. And that would have given Kerr some sort of support, I think, for the position he was in. He'd not expected to be under such enormous protest, dismay, aggravation from the Australian community. It was very divided, intensely polarised. And Kerr, from these early letters, expected that would pass within a few months. That he wrote to Charteris and said, this is the same renter crowd, it will pass. And of course it didn't. And his version of events very quickly became unstuck as people came forward and revealed what had happened. And he was always looking for support. He wanted Sir Anthony Mason, for example, to allow him to publish his role. Mason refused. Mason kept that role secret for 37 years until I found it in Kerr's papers. But Kerr wanted them published. He wanted Barwick's material published, which Barwick reluctantly agreed to. And he wanted some of the palace letters published, I think, for the same reason, that he would have been able to show he'd been in discussion with the palace, and that would have helped him stake his claim for some legitimacy over what was fast unravelling as a legitimate action.
Jenny, you just mentioned Sir Anthony Mason, and I don't think at this point he has done an interview, and you've asked him for an interview. Is that correct?
I interviewed him twice when I was working on Whitlam's biography. I had asked, his name had come up in sort of oblique ways. The closest that it came up was that he'd read Sir Gough Barwick's advice to Kerr the day before the dismissal. But there are a lot of rumours that there might be more. He refused to speak to me about anything to do with the dismissal, so we discussed other matters, which was, charming and very interesting. After that first interview, I found Kerr's 12-page note detailing the months of discussions with Sir Anthony Mason, then a High Court judge, the secret meetings, the secret discussions, Mason's active role in drafting a letter of dismissal for Kerr. All of it secret from the Prime Minister. It was staggering, volcanic. The Australian described it as a find of historic significance. It changed the way we looked on the dismissal. You could no longer say that Kerr acted alone. And so I did ask to see Mason again, and I did ask him directly whether in the interests of history, he would speak to me about his role. And as you know, because we've discussed it, he said what I find a very chilling and quite reprehensible remark. He said, "I owe history nothing." And that sticks with me so strongly because he was, through most of his professional life, a senior public figure, and yet in acting with the Governor-General, guiding and, as Kerr says, fortifying me for the action I was to take, he acted secret from elected government. And worse than that, he acted secret from Australian history for 37 years, refusing to allow his role to come out. In the interim, the Hawke Labor government had appointed him Chief Justice. And I spoke to one of the Hawke ministers soon after I located this, who was extraordinarily distressed, really distressed, almost in tears, and said we would never have appointed him Chief Justice had we known of his role in the end of the last Labor government before them. To me, it was a really staggering, chilling moment. And things like that have come into this sort of archival journey, they humanise it, but they also, I think, reveal some of the really dark aspects of the dismissal that just continues to shock people, including me, even after all these years.
Jenny, if you had the opportunity to interview him about his role in the dismissal, if you had an opportunity to ask him a couple of questions, what would they be?
I had a bit of a think about that, Nikki. Look, I think I would ask him whether he regrets that deception, as I said, that deception of the Prime Minister and the government at the time in 1975, but also that deception of Australian history and the Australian people because of that history since, because nobody knew of that role or could have imagined that active role until it happened to be located. And I would be intensely interested on to hear him speak about how he came to such an extraordinary decision and believed it was the right thing for him from a moral perspective, quite aside from all of the constitutional and political ones, to engage in. And the second thing gets back to the matter I raised before, that whether he felt any sense of impropriety in failing to reveal to the Hawke government something that is a material concern that would have really been at issue for the Hawke Labor government in making that decision. You should reveal matters that might have an impact on a decision of that nature, and he chose again to keep it secret. I know that members of that government felt distressed by that fact, and again, I would be very interested to hear his comments on it. He has refused to speak since. He issued a public statement the day after my book came out, where he acknowledged that I had found this material. He acknowledged that it had happened largely as Kerr set it out. There were a couple of, one fairly major difference, but the substance of it was as indicated by Kerr.
Jenny, your battle with National Archives to have the Palace letters released took 10 years, involving first the Federal Court, then the High Court. Why did they fight so hard to keep those letters secret?
Yeah, it was an extraordinary decision by the Archives. They'd always called these letters personal, and that simply meant that whoever deposited them could set their own personal conditions of access. They don't come under the Archives Act. You can't appeal to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. The only way to challenge it is go to the Federal Court. They argued they had to respect, as they said, the conditions set by what they call the depositor, that is Sir John Kerr. The problem was, once our court case got underway, we realised that these conditions of access weren't set by Sir John Kerr, they're actually set by the Queen, and that was a great difficulty for their legal argument. But the Archives was as determined as Government House and Buckingham Palace that the letters must not be released. Buckingham Palace, which contributed some letters to a submission from Government House that went to the Federal Court, also argued strongly that our letters in our own National Archive should not be released. And I thought it was very interesting that in those letters they presumed to tell us what our own Archives Act meant, which was, of course, what the court was finding at the time. And I thought, extraordinary imperial presumption over our Archives Act, which the High Court found quite otherwise. And they said, these letters do not come under your Archives Act. They are personal, wrong on both counts. But my main animating drive was that this is our history. We have a right to know our history. And so I was determined to try and open it. But I think the other thing worrying Buckingham Palace very strongly, apart from the volcanic content of these letters, is that it sets a precedent. No, we've achieved something in this High Court case that I think is extraordinary. Nowhere in any other Commonwealth nation, there's about 15 that use this exact same notion of royal secrecy, a convention of royal secrecy, to lock away any correspondence of the monarch with prime ministers, with governors general, with governors, just routinely, reflexively, royal secrecy, don't look at them. And there's nothing we can do about it. So this now is a challenge to that. You know, lawyers love a precedent. They have a precedent now. And there's a precedent for opening royal archives all through the Commonwealth countries. Somebody wants to take that very big step and challenge the royal grasp over the Queen's letters. And I think for transparency and accountability in a modern democracy, surely that's fundamental.
Absolutely. Jenny, you mentioned at one point in your book that the Director General of National Archives, David Fricker, who evidently was the Deputy Director General of ASIO previously in a previous career, wrote a secret affidavit that was so sensitive, neither you nor your legal team could view it, yet it was a significant factor, presumably, in the federal court proceedings. Are you able to speculate on the contents of that affidavit?
It was a remarkable thing to see the Director General of our own archives, which is tasked with bringing documents, historic documents, to public access, arguing in our federal court that he could put forward a secret affidavit that I couldn't see, that my lawyers couldn't see, and that only the judge could see in reaching a decision about these letters. I don't know what could possibly be in such a secret affidavit. It was extraordinary to me that the head of a public collecting institution could even suggest such a thing. And I go through in the book, the Palace Letters, several other aspects of the archives, a response to this case that I find deeply troubling for a body that is tasked with protecting our most significant historical records, including arguing in court that there was what's called public interest immunity, which meant that there was a greater public interest, and this is the head of the archives arguing this, that there's a greater public interest in keeping those letters secret than there was in the clear and undoubted public interest in reading them and in knowing our history. I found that extraordinary. Recently in Senate estimates, David Fricker, who's the head of the archives, did say that he would consider releasing that secret affidavit. So I'm hopeful that it will be released, since he did make that clear at Senate estimates. But as yet, as far as I know, it has not yet been released. So I'd be intrigued to know what's in it. But I imagine it will draw very heavily on the views of Buckingham Palace, who the archives seemed to be totally deferential to in reaching some of these decisions.
Jenny, just skipping ahead to May of this year, and after so many years of hard work, talk us through the morning of Friday, May 29th this year, when the High Court delivered the verdict. Where were you and how did that day unfold?
I was at home in Melbourne, where we had been in lockdown pretty much since the High Court had heard our case in February. So in writing the book, I wanted to bring in the fact also that the passage of the case through the High Court in particular, the hearing and the outcome, really tracked with this dreadful pandemic that had just closed the High Court really within weeks of our hearing in February. So I was at home. I was obviously not going to be able to be in Canberra at the High Court when the decision was made. And it was, in a way, it was sort of surreal. I was flicking between, right here where I am now, flicking between my computer and the live tweeting from the High Court, my emails in case somebody sent me something. And then I had my phone on, of course, and suddenly I got a text from Terry King, who had worked with me as the publicist on this campaign to raise funds and to take the case from the very beginning. And I say in the book, I couldn't think of a better person to pass this news on to me. And it had one word with a lot of exclamation marks, and the word was yes. And that's how I found out. And it was extraordinary. And within seconds, my phone was going, Twitter was going off. And it was just bizarre because Terry had organised a makeshift sort of press conference down the road from where I live because I couldn't go into any studios. We all had to socially distance. All of this is very COVID related. And so I was racing down there in the car, speaking to one of the lawyers who was telling me what the outcome was. And we still didn't know how many judges had found in our favour. And he's going, it's 5. It's 5. You've got 5 judges. No, it's 6. It's actually 6. 6-1 decision. So, I was literally hearing this, trying to get the key points and racing to speak to media who were absolutely fascinated in that really groundbreaking decision. So it was a fantastic day. It'll remain with me forever. But I just thought, what a wonderful decision for history, because opening up the discussions between the two people at top of the apex of a constitutional monarchy, the monarch herself and our Governor-General, such a critical time in our history. It's, for a historian, this is pay dirt. This is the most precious, extraordinary addition to the history of the dismissal we could ever imagine.
And Jenny, Terry mentioned you did about 9 hours straight of interviews that day, but I can remember at the time that, the question then was, will everything be released? When will it be released, and how will it be released? Will you gain access, especially because of the, the long, quest that you had to have them released? And as we, soon found out that they would actually be released online and publicly to everyone at the same time. You were still stuck in Melbourne, I think, at the point in mid-July when they were released. Can you talk to me about that day now? And it started with, I think, a press conference from the National Archives, which ran through some of the highlights of the letters. And of course, as soon as this information came out, I was one of the journalists, along with hundreds of journalists probably around Australia, who was turning around a story quickly. And of course, little snippets of information are released and they became the headlines. How did you feel, I guess, seeing that information come out so quickly like that, and then the headlines starting to form?
Oh, look, there are a couple of things about that day that were pretty disappointing, I have to say. One was that I was not asked to be involved in the release of the letters at all. And I think that was churlish. It was unfortunate. And it wasn't just that I wasn't there as somebody, I think, who, let's face it, to be respectful ought to have been, by Zoom, of course. It was interesting that in Senate estimates, again, David Fricker, the head of the archives, was asked about that and was asked whether the Attorney-General actually said to him, expressed some concern about that fact. And it came out in Senate estimates that that's correct, that Christian Porter actually said to David Fricker that he felt uncomfortable about that and I should be involved. But what it meant was, I think, that there wasn't a historian involved. There wasn't a historian who was actually able to interpret the letters in a broader framework. And as you said, what that meant was that you got snippets, you got inferences drawn from a single letter written after the event, after the dismissal itself. But look, in the end, that's just my own personal view of the disappointment of seeing 9 letters represented by David Fricker and being asked to tell a story from them. And yes, there are a lot of headlines that went round at that time, but the longer story is, and the good story is, the letters were released in full. There were no redactions. And the longer term assessment that many, many people now have made of the letters is quite a different one from the immediate sort of gotcha moment, which I found frustrating on the day. But that's an inevitability of that sort of public event. The bottom line is I'm delighted they've been released, delighted that we now can draw our conclusions from them. And the longer term view has been a vastly different one from that circulating on that day. And that's the historical perspective. That's the history that is now set.
Jenny, I'm just going to read a question now that's come through from one of our viewers on Facebook, and it's Matthew who's asking you, what are your thoughts on the impact of this journey in regards to the emancipation of the Commonwealth?
Look, I do think this court case, the judgments, I should say, the High Court judgments, are extremely significant in ways that we haven't yet looked at, we've tended to focus, as you would expect, very much on the fact that the court case succeeded in having royal correspondence released, as I said, a world first. But in doing so, there's a really interesting passage in the decision of the plurality judgment, which is the judgment of the 4 judges, including the Chief Justice, and then there are another 2 single judges that also went in our favour. In that larger judgment, there's a very important statement that they recognise that in this judgment, in this decision, they are going against the wishes of the Queen, that in this decision, they recognise that they are going against the expectation of the Queen and Government House. But they make the fascinating comment that you might think could have been written 120 years ago, that it is important to note that the wishes of the Queen cannot have to be taken over by our statute law. And our statute law, of course, in this case is the Archives Act. In other words, the Archives Act must prevail. Australian law must prevail despite the wishes of the Queen. And I find that both a really important, significant comment, but also quite remarkable that we have to state such a thing in the year 2020. And that's where I think the impact on the Commonwealth and other Commonwealth nations lies. That, as I said before, it's the potential for a precedent. I think the other thing it does is it lets people know that there are still aspects of our system that are inappropriately linked to the Crown. And it's often said in relation to a move to a republic, but there's nothing broken, don't fix it. Well, there's a lot broken in my view, and this is one of them. The Queen also vetted, or the Buckingham Palace also vetted Kerr's memoirs, and I think, again, that's an outrageous intervention in our historical knowledge. And the Queen prevented us from looking at these letters. She placed an embargo over them. So there's real aspects of the impact of the monarchy still that we will not fully sever unless we move to a republic.
Jenny, can I just pick up on that point that you made there about the letters that were that Sir John Kerr had to keep out of his memoirs, and were they between him and Sir Martin Charteris? Again, they were informal exchanges, I think you refer to them as. This is obviously different to what's come out publicly in the Palace letters. One can only imagine what are in these documents. Do you have any idea yourself what could be in these letters that the Queen did not want published?
It's a little bit unclear from the letters, and this is another set of letters after Kerr left office, which show quite clearly a discussion about leaving out, as you said, key discussions with Sir Martin Charteris, leaving them out from his memoir. They don't want anyone to know about them. It's a little bit unclear whether that is in fact referring to the material in the Palace letters or whether there's an additional area they're calling informal exchanges. We do know that there are a lot of telephone calls between them, but we also know that Kerr did not divulge the contents of his discussions in the Palace letters in his memoirs. He left them out. He omitted them. He writes back to the Palace in 1978 and says, I have done my best to omit any reference to my informal exchanges with Sir Martin Charteris. I'm very glad that, and the Palace thanks him. That's what they want. They want an expurgated version of history. So when you hear it said that the Palace was not involved, there's another element to that, which is that the Palace ensures that we do not know the ways in which they are involved, partly because they had Kerr remove those aspects from his memoir. So his memoir is revealed as deeply flawed, as omitting key elements on the instructions of the Palace. And again, I find this an absolutely startling intervention into our knowledge of our history. So whether it also refers to telephone conversations or whether there are others, it remains to be seen. But I think you could also see it as simply referring to the way in which he did not reveal the details of the Palace letters at that time.
Jenny, another question from Facebook, and it's from Johanna, who asks, why do you think Whitlam became so serene about what happened? Was it self-preservation, or did he make peace with it, recognising he could never know what's going on?
That is a very interesting biographical question that I asked myself when I was working on that biography. Look, what I realised, and it is in the second volume to some extent, is it was actually terribly broken in the first probably 5 years or so after that. You know, for him personally, he'd been in the Labor Party all his adult life. He believed in what he called the Great Australian Labor Party as a means of change and progress. He had a magnificent vision that he was only halfway through putting in place. He'd been in the parliament for nearly 20 years when he took office, and he steered the Labor Party through the most horrendous division and unelectability of the 1960s. 20 years in parliament, had just become Prime Minister 3 years earlier, had succeeded at 2 elections, and all of that ended in 20 seconds in the Governor-General's study. So, you know, it's an extraordinary story, operatic in its aspect, but he did suffer enormously. He barely managed to get through the next 2 years in Parliament. Many people described that he was a broken man, that he was nothing like the parliamentary performer he had been before. I think what saved him, and it's very, very important part of his life that's often forgotten, is that Bob Hawke appointed him as Australia's ambassador to UNESCO in 1983. Whitlam had a distinguished 6 years, first 3 years as ambassador, and then 3 years as an elected member of the UNESCO board. They lived in Paris. They lived in a magnificent Harry Seidler designed building where the Australian embassy is. And I think that gave him a world stage, not just an Australian stage. And that's what I think helped him survive, because so many people in politics are devastated and destroyed by matters like that. I think Doc Evatt was in the early 50s, and do not ever really recover. But Whitlam did, and again, that's part of my biography of him is to track that change and that development. And Margaret Whitlam, his wife Margaret, was just an immense rock, and you know, the critical part in that survival, emotionally and psychologically.
Jenny, I wanted to ask you about Prince Charles, and there's been, you know, a lot of people are very interested. A lot of people probably, up until recently, didn't realise that Prince Charles had a relationship with Sir John Kerr, and was privy to some information, I guess, before the dismissal that was somewhat surprising. I think you first discovered this through some of Sir John Kerr's diary notes. But I was just wondering if you'd be able to talk to us about a gathering at PNG for Independence Day. You've described it previously as an almost Shakespearean gathering with Prince Charles, Whitlam, Sir John Kerr, Malcolm Fraser, all there, I think. Can you talk us through the significance of conversations that day, particularly involving Prince Charles?
Yes, I think Kerr might have imagined he had a much closer relationship with Prince Charles than Prince Charles imagined in return. Kerr was a shocking snob, it has to be said, and a vowed monarchist. I really love, sorry, I'm digressing, but I really love Malcolm Turnbull's wonderful foreword to this book. And he says, he describes there, Kerr's sycophantic grovelling is stomach churning. And in relation to each of the members of the monarchy, it absolutely is. In this journal, he describes speaking to Charles in PNG at Independence Day celebration. And the reason I find it so dramatic and visual is that all of the key protagonists are there. Barwick, Kerr, Whitlam, Prince Charles, etc., and Malcolm Fraser. Actually, I don't think Fraser is there, but there's a series of conversations, none of which involve Whitlam. And Kerr writes that he discussed with Charles in September 1975 his fear that he would be recalled from office of Governor-General by Gough Whitlam while he was considering the possibility of dismissing the government. It's an extraordinary conversation to report, because it's 4 weeks before supply is even blocked in the Senate, and yet he's wargaming, if you like, with Prince Charles that he may at some point need to dismiss the government. He's concerned that he will then be recalled from office if Whitlam finds out about it, and he's sounding out Charles to get Charles's response. And it's critical because he reports in his journal that Charles is extremely solicitous and concerned for Kerr's continued appointment as Governor-General, makes no comment about the prospect of dismissing the elected government from office, and then goes back to, when he returns to Buckingham Palace, reports that conversation to the Queen and to Sir Martin Charteris. So it's a critical letter to look for once the Palace letters were released. Was there a letter matching Kerr's description in his journal? That would actually show that his journal was accurate, which would be one of the few things about Kerr that was, and that the way in which he described the Queen now being aware from September that Kerr was considering the possible dismissal of the government, was that correct? And there is such a letter. It's in early October. It's exactly as Kerr indicated. what that tells us is that the palace had been privy to Kerr's planning, his thinking, the possibility of dismissal from as early as September 1975. It's a really significant letter.
And I think you said that was probably one of the first ones that you looked at when the letters were released. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's the one I went to straight away because I knew how important it was for verifying what to me is an absolutely astonishing conversation to be had with our next monarch, the next King of Australia, King Charles. It's a vastly improper conversation to be having. It's one in which negative commentary is had about the government of the day. It breaches every aspect of the responsibility of a constitutional monarch, primarily to have no role in domestic political matters and to always be politically neutral. That is on the Buckingham Palace website. The Queen is politically neutral at all times. These letters show that that is not the case.
Jenny, I think I might have time to sneak in one more question, maybe two. You dedicate this book to your mum, Barbara, and mention she was prominent in your mind when you went to the High Court. What impact has she had on you and your career, and particularly your quest to have the letters released?
Oh, my mother had an enormous impact on me. She was a very, very strong woman, I have to say, extremely intelligent woman. And she was a lawyer. She was the first barrister briefed in the Mabo case. She saw as her life's work being a theoretical argument about why the common law should recognise native title. She gave a famous paper at the Townsville conference where Eddie Mabo spoke, and her paper was called There Should Be a High Court Case Taken to Argue Native Title. And she's been called the intellectual architect of the Mabo case. I'm immensely proud of her work in that area. But I also saw how difficult it was for her with 4 young children, how many things she did that women, I think, of our generation who also work probably don't have to do, and the different expectations. So yes, I was very aware of her important role, and I'm so proud to be able to dedicate this book to her. Also because I think I have a lasting interest in the law, but I never wanted to actually do law. But I'm interested in the intersections between law, politics, and history. You know, and what a more wonderful case could you find than this one to bring all of those themes together in the way that this book has. Thank you, Mum.
Sure, she's very proud of the work that you've done, Jenny. And I imagine from now on you might be ready to have a holiday or a break. But just quickly before I pass back to Sunil, I was just wondering what's next on your agenda. Have you got any plans, or is it just to have a bit of a break?
I always have plans, I think, but I am going to have quite a long break. It's been a very, very long time, a delightful time, a fascinating time. I feel so grateful to our extraordinary legal team, Andy Whitlam QC, Brett Walker SC, Tom Brennan SC, and of course Chambers Westgarth, who carried this along all the way with their wonderful public spiritedness in believing that we ought to have access to these letters. And I am going to have a break, but there's also a marvellous book I've been working on and off for about 5 years now, which is totally different, set in colonial times and following a feisty woman who has about 6 male members of her family are all in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and she is not. But it's an intergenerational story that I think will really tell a story of Australian settlement, very troubling relations with Indigenous people from a family that moves from Sydney down to what becomes Victoria and ends up with Australian rules football. So it's a fascinating story, but I'm not getting back to it for another probably 8 or 9 months.
I think you've earned a really good rest and a holiday, Jenny. But congratulations on this book, and congratulations on having the letters released. It's extraordinary what you've managed to achieve, and a lot of people are so grateful for the work that you've done. So thank you. It's been great having a conversation with you tonight.
Thank you, Nikki. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you again to Roaring Stories. It's been a marvellous evening. Thank you so much.
So I'll just hand over.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Nikki, for such a revealing conversation. about, what should I say, intriguing about all those palace intrigues as well. I mean, I can't wait to see who plays you in The Crown Series 9, Jenny.
Well, it'd be nice if The Crown Series 10 actually remembers that Australia exists, I think. We've been forgotten along the way.
The Palace Letters by Jenny Hocking is published by Scribe, and don't forget that you can buy a copy online on Facebook Live. Just go down below the comments, or else go to roaringstories.com.au to purchase a copy. And if you live in Balmain and surrounding suburbs, you can get postage for free. Don't forget, when you do go on the Roaring Stories website, to sign up for our newsletter with news of discounts, sales, events, interviews with your favourite authors and stories by them as well. And I hope that we'll see you this Thursday to interview the wonderful Cerridwen Dovey, who shares a name with Gough Whitlam's wife.
That's right, Margaret Dovey, she was initially.
We'll have to ask Cerridwen about her new book, Life After Truth. I don't know how your last school or college reunion was, but this one is very surprising, very engaging, and very timely. So why don't you join us next week in the store or on Facebook Live to hear more about Cerridwen Dovey's wonderful new book, Life After Truth. I'm Sunil Badami. I hope to see you then, or before then, in the store. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.